Commander Zelith stood at the front of the massive simulation chamber, her chitinous plates gleaming under the cold blue lights of the Galactic Military Academy. Her mandibles clicked together in a rhythm that every cadet in the room had learned to recognize as satisfaction. The sound meant someone was about to have a very bad day. 6 human cadets stood in a loose formation near the back of the orientation hall. They were shorter than most of the other species present, their skin looking fragile and soft compared to the scales, carapaces, and armored hides of their classmates. Cadet Lieutenant Ryan Carter stood at the front of the small group, his hands clasped behind his back in a military stance that looked almost quaint compared to the elaborate postures of the alien cadets around them. Commander Zelitha's eyes, all 4 of them, focused on the human group. She had been an instructor at this academy for 43 standard years. She had trained warriors from over 200 different species. She had seen the proud brought low and the arrogant humbled. These soft little creatures from Earth would be no different. Cadets, her voice boomed through the translation devices everyone wore. Today you will face your final examination. The Korthian scenario. A murmur ran through the assembled students. The Korthian scenario was legendary. It was whispered about in the dormitories, discussed in hushed tones over meals, and feared by every cadet who entered the war college. The humans exchanged glances but said nothing. The scenario simulates a 10-year galactic conflict, Zelith continued, gesturing to the holographic displays that flickered to life behind her. Star systems rotated in the air, connected by trade routes and defensive perimeters. 12 factions. 7 habitable systems. Countless variables. The finest command teams in the galaxy typically require 3 months of strategic planning to achieve even a partial success. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. You have 72 hours. The other cadet teams immediately began organizing. The Vrelians, with their 6 arms and computational minds, started pulling up data screens and assigning roles. The Thandorians formed a circle, their tentacles intertwining as they initiated their group consciousness protocols. Even the Kravians, known throughout the galaxy for their aggressive nature, were methodically dividing responsibilities and establishing chains of command. The humans just stood there. Carter turned to his team. There were 6 of them in total. Nina Hayes stood to his right, a tall woman with dark skin and observant eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Tyler Brooks was next to her, stocky and built like someone who had grown up in heavy gravity. Sophie Grant, Lucas Reed, and Lily Morgan completed the group, each watching Carter with expressions of focused attention. Conference, Carter said quietly. The 6 humans moved to a corner of the orientation hall and formed a tight circle. 4 minutes passed. Around them, the other teams were deep into their planning phases. The Vrelians had already created a preliminary timeline spanning the next 60 days. The Thandorians were accessing their ancestral military databases, pulling tactical information that went back thousands of years. Holographic displays floated around each team, showing formation analyses, resource allocation charts, and diplomatic probability matrices. The humans were just talking. No displays. No data streams. Just 6 people having a conversation that looked almost casual. Instructor Voth, an elderly Solarian who served as the simulation proctor, moved between the teams with his datapad, checking on progress and answering questions. He approached the human group with some curiosity. In his 70 years of running this simulation, he had seen every approach imaginable. Or so he thought. Carter looked up as Voth approached. Sir, I have a question about the scenario parameters. Of course, Cadet Lieutenant. Voth's chromatophores shifted to an encouraging green color. He appreciated students who asked thoughtful questions. Are there any rules restricting what we can do within the scenario's established physics and political framework? Voth consulted his datapad, though he already knew the answer. It was a standard question. Cadets always looked for tactical advantages within the rules. Teams are free to use any strategy that does not violate the simulation's fundamental parameters. The scenario runs on established physics, the political structures are fixed at the starting point, and all factions operate under realistic economic and military constraints. And there's no restriction on how we choose to use our starting resources? None whatsoever. The scenario is designed to test strategic thinking within realistic constraints, not to limit creative approaches. Carter nodded. Thank you, sir. Voth moved on to the next team, making a note on his datapad that the humans had asked a procedural question. Standard behavior. Nothing remarkable. Behind him, Carter turned back to his team. Nina Hayes was smiling in a way that made several nearby alien cadets shift uncomfortably. There was something predatory in that expression, something that triggered ancient instincts even in species that had never evolved alongside human hunters. Tyler Brooks pulled up a holographic map of the scenario's starting configuration on his personal device. It was a small display, nothing like the elaborate planning systems the other teams were using. He zoomed in on a cluster of small markers in what the scenario designated as neutral territory. "These?" he asked quietly. "Those," Carter confirmed. Sophie Grant started laughing. It was not a loud laugh, but in the serious atmosphere of the orientation hall, it carried. Several alien cadets looked over in confusion. Laughter was not typically associated with final examinations that could determine one's entire military career. Lucas Reed was already running calculations on his own device, his fingers moving quickly across the holographic interface. "If we strip everything else and commit fully, we can pull it off," Nina finished. "The question is whether we want to bet everything on this." Carter looked at each of his teammates in turn. "Alternative is we spend 3 days planning a conventional approach and maybe achieve a 30% success rating like everyone else who has ever run this scenario. Or we try something that either works spectacularly or fails completely within the first hour." "I vote spectacular," Lily Morgan said. The others nodded in agreement. 20 minutes after they had first huddled together, the human team approached Instructor Voth's station. Around them, every other cadet team was still deep in their planning phases. Some had barely finished assigning roles. The Vrelians were on hour 1 of what would be a detailed 3-day strategic analysis. Carter handed Voth a data chip. "Our opening moves, sir." Voth's chromatophores flashed yellow in surprise. "Cadet Lieutenant, you have 72 hours for planning. Are you certain you do not wish to use more of that time?" "We're certain, sir. We'd also like to request that the simulation run at maximum processing speed." Maximum speed meant the simulation would run at 50 times normal rate. Years of scenario time would pass in minutes of real time. It was typically only used in the final phases when teams wanted to see the long-term results of strategies they had already committed to. "That is highly irregular," Voth said, but he was already loading the data chip into his system. His curiosity was too strong to resist. What could these humans possibly have planned that required immediate execution? "If our approach works, we'll know quickly," Carter explained. "If it fails, we'll have time to try something conventional." Nina Hayes added with that unsettling smile, "We'd hate to waste everyone's time with a strategy that doesn't work." Voth looked at the submitted moves on his screen. His chromatophores went through a rapid series of colors that his species associated with confusion and disbelief. The humans were abandoning their starting territories. All of them. They were concentrating every ship, every resource, every soldier into a massive thrust toward a cluster of mining outposts in neutral space. It made no strategic sense whatsoever. "Cadets, I must ask, do you understand the victory conditions of this scenario? Territorial control, diplomatic influence, and economic stability are all factors. These mining stations have minimal strategic value." "We understand, sir," Carter said calmly. Voth hesitated, then made a decision that he would spend years analyzing. He approved the moves and set the simulation to maximum speed. "Very well. Please proceed to the simulation chamber. The scenario will begin in 5 minutes." The 6 humans walked toward the chamber doors. Behind them, the other cadet teams continued their meticulous planning, unaware that the scenario they would spend days preparing for was about to be fundamentally changed. As the humans strapped into their command couches and the neural interfaces activated, Instructor Voth sent out an alert to the senior staff. Something in his long experience told him that what was about to happen would be worth observing. The simulation chamber doors sealed shut. The holographic galaxy sprang to life around the human cadets, 12 factions glowing in different colors, 7 habitable systems pulsing with activity, and countless ships moving along their programmed routes. In the observation gallery above, instructors began to gather. Commander Zealith arrived, expecting to witness the first of many failures these humans would experience before they learned proper military doctrine. The simulation began to run. Years started passing in minutes. And the humans, with expressions of calm focus, began to execute a plan that would shatter 8 centuries of military theory. The observation gallery filled rapidly as alerts pinged across the Academy's network. Instructors abandoned their lessons and senior cadets left their training exercises to crowd around the massive viewing screens that showed the Corthian scenario in progress. What they saw made no sense. The human forces were retreating. Not tactically withdrawing or executing a strategic repositioning, but actively abandoning every single starting position they had been given. Ships lifted off from defensive installations, troops evacuated from forward bases, and supply depots were stripped bare. Every asset the humans controlled was moving in the same direction, toward a cluster of mining outposts in neutral territory that every military analyst in the galaxy had long ago classified as strategically worthless. Commander Zelith watched the displays with her mandibles hanging open in an expression her species reserved for witnessing complete incompetence. Around her, instructors from a dozen different species muttered in their various languages, their translation devices creating a babble of confused commentary. "They are abandoning defended positions," a Vrelian instructor stated, his computational mind unable to process such an obvious tactical error. "This violates the most basic principles of military strategy." "Perhaps they misunderstand the scenario objectives," offered a Vandorian commander, her tentacles writhing with uncertainty. In the simulation chamber below, the 6 humans worked with an intensity that seemed rehearsed despite having met only weeks ago during academy orientation. Ryan Carter sat in the central command couch, neural interface glowing against his temple as he directed overall strategy. His voice was calm and steady as he issued orders. "Tyler, how long until we have full control of the mining facilities?" Tyler Brooks monitored the tactical display showing their forces converging on the target zone. 18 minutes simulation time. No resistance. The stations are in neutral territory and nobody's bothering to defend them. "Sophie, are you ready for Phase 2? Sophie Grant's hands moved across holographic controls, pulling up engineering schematics and resource calculations. "Ready. Once we control the stations, I need 48 hours simulation time to retrofit the facilities." Around them in the observation gallery, the other faction forces were doing exactly what any rational military power would do. They saw abandoned territory and moved to claim it. The Vrelian faction deployed occupation forces to the former human positions. The Kravian fleet moved to secure the defensive installations the humans had left behind. Every faction in the scenario was expanding their territorial control while the humans concentrated on worthless rocks in the middle of nowhere. Instructor Voth stood near the main display, his chromatophores cycling through colors that indicated deep thought. Unlike the others, he was not watching the territorial movements. He was watching the resource displays, the material composition readouts of those mining stations the humans were so focused on. His eyes widened. "Commander Zelith," he said quietly, "you should look at this." Zelith moved to his station, irritation clear in her movements. "What am I looking at, instructor?" "The mineral composition of those mining outposts. Thorium deposits. Rare earth elements. Heavy metals. Yes, common materials. Every species has access to such resources. They are too inefficient for modern military production. This is basic academy knowledge. For us, yes." Voth's chromatophores flashed an amber color that indicated he had made a connection others had missed. But humans did not develop fusion technology until after they reached space. Their early military-industrial base was built on fission reactors and chemical processes. They know how to use these materials in ways we never needed to learn. In the simulation chamber, Sophie Grant was smiling as the mining stations fell under human control. The facilities were old, built centuries ago when this region of space had been considered valuable. They had been abandoned when more efficient resource extraction methods became available, left to automated maintenance systems that kept them functional but forgotten. To every other species in the galaxy, these stations represented obsolete technology and inefficient materials. To Sophie, who had grown up in a family of engineering contractors on Earth, they represented opportunity. "Beginning conversion," she announced to her team. "This is going to get loud." The simulation's time compression meant that hours of work passed in minutes of real time. The observation gallery watched in growing confusion as the humans began tearing apart the mining stations and rebuilding them into something else entirely. Construction drones swarmed over the facilities like insects, welding and cutting and assembling at a pace that seemed frantic. "What are they building?" Commander Zelith demanded. The answer came 12 minutes of real time later, as the simulation reached year 2 of the 10-year scenario. The mining stations had been transformed into shipyards, but not like any shipyards the Galactic Military Academy had ever seen. Where conventional facilities took weeks to produce a single vessel built to exacting standards of efficiency and longevity, these human factories were churning out ships at a rate that made the simulation's economic algorithms flag errors. Lucas Reed managed the production queues with the calm efficiency of someone managing an assembly line. He was not building ships that would last decades or perform optimally across all mission profiles. He was building ships that would work well enough for one purpose and could be manufactured in massive quantities. The vessels rolling out of the converted facilities were ugly by galactic standards. They had oversized engines that burned fuel inefficiently. Their hull plating was thicker than necessary in some places and dangerously thin in others. Their weapon systems were crude mass drivers and missile racks instead of elegant energy weapons. They looked like something a primitive species would build before discovering proper technology. They also cost 1/10 the resources of a standard galactic warship and could be produced 50 times faster. Impossible, breathed the Vrelian instructor, running calculations on his own interface. The resource expenditure does not match established economic models. They are producing vessels at a rate that should bankrupt their entire faction within months. Check the sustainability metrics, Voth suggested quietly. The instructor pulled up the data and his face went pale. The human ships were designed to be disposable. The production model assumed a 70% loss rate per engagement, but the manufacturing capacity meant they could replace losses faster than any enemy could inflict them. It was not about building ships that survived. It was about building ships faster than they could be destroyed. In the simulation, Year 3 arrived. The human fleet had reached critical mass. Thousands of crude warships filled the space around the converted mining stations like a swarm of angry insects. The observation gallery had gone completely silent as they tried to process what they were seeing. Nina Hayes took control of the communication systems. She pulled up profiles of all 12 factions in the scenario, studied their cultural backgrounds and strategic positions for approximately 30 seconds, then began transmitting. The message went to every faction simultaneously. It was not diplomatic. It was not nuanced. It was brutally simple. Unconditional alliance offered. Join the human coalition within 6 simulation hours or be designated hostile and eliminated. No negotiation. No exceptions. Choose now. Commander Zealith felt something cold run through her body as she heard the message. It was not a diplomatic overture. It was an ultimatum backed by overwhelming force. The humans had created a situation where every faction had to make an immediate decision with incomplete information and no time for careful analysis. The faction leaders in the simulation, controlled by sophisticated artificial intelligence programmed with centuries of diplomatic and military wisdom, did what any rational leader would do when faced with an unknown threat. They tried to form counter-alliances. They attempted to open negotiations. They sent requests for clarification and time extensions. Nina rejected every attempt at negotiation with the same message: 6 hours. Choose. The simulation's AI governing the Belkarian faction was the first to break. It ran probability calculations and determined that the human fleet, while technologically inferior, represented an overwhelming numerical advantage. The cost of resistance was high. The terms of surrender, while humiliating, allowed for survival and potential future autonomy. 20 minutes into the 6-hour deadline, the Belkarian faction transmitted its acceptance. That transmission started a cascade reaction that no one in the observation gallery had anticipated. The other factions watched the Belkarians capitulate and had to recalculate their own positions. If one major faction had joined the humans, the military balance had already shifted. Every hour of delay meant facing an even larger coalition. Every faction that joined made resistance more costly for those who remained. The second faction surrendered 40 minutes later. Then the third. Then the fourth. Lily Morgan monitored the diplomatic channels with an expression of satisfaction. They're panicking. Each surrender makes the others more afraid to be left out. How many? Carter asked. 5 factions have joined. 3 more are requesting terms. The remaining 4 are trying to form a defensive alliance. Let them, Carter said calmly. It's already too late. In the observation gallery, a visiting Grand Admiral from the Vandorian fleet made a sound that her translator could not process. She had served in actual combat for 60 years. She had commanded fleets in 3 different conflicts. She recognized what she was seeing because she had seen it before in corporate takeovers and political coups, but never in military operations. This is not warfare, she said quietly. This is a hostile acquisition. Commander Zealith finally found her voice. How long has the simulation been running? 43 minutes real time, Voth replied. Simulation Year 3.2. The Vrelian cadet team, who had spent the last 43 minutes in careful strategic planning for their own scenario attempt, looked at their elaborate preparation documents with expressions of growing horror. They had just reached the point in their planning where they would begin preliminary diplomatic outreach. The humans had already conquered or absorbed 8 of the 12 factions. Tyler Brooks expanded the tactical display to show the current state of the galaxy. The human coalition controlled 58% of all strategic resources, 43% of habitable territory, and had the largest combined fleet in the scenario by a factor of 4. Phase 3, he asked Carter. Phase 3, Carter confirmed. The human fleet split into multiple task forces, each one moving toward the territories of the 4 remaining resistant factions. The forces were not moving cautiously or establishing supply lines or securing their flanks. They were moving with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from having overwhelming numerical superiority and absolutely nothing to lose. In the observation gallery, instructors and cadets alike watched in stunned silence as the 10-year Corthian scenario, the legendary unwinnable final examination that had humbled 8 centuries of military academy graduates, collapsed into something that looked less like a strategic exercise and more like watching a predator corner its prey. Commander Zealith pulled up the historical records one more time, certain there must be some precedent for what she was witnessing. The data confirmed what she already knew but could not quite accept. In 800 years of operation, no cadet team had ever achieved more than a 34% territorial control rating. The humans were currently at 58% and climbing. And they had been in the simulation chamber for less than an hour. The first major engagement happened in Simulation Year 4, and it was nothing like what the Academy instructors expected from modern warfare. The human coalition fleet met the combined forces of the resistant Kravian and Velthori factions near the Tertian Belt, an asteroid field that military doctrine suggested would be defended through careful positioning and tactical superiority. Lucas Reed sat in his command couch, studying the enemy formation with the detached interest of someone examining a math problem. The opposing fleet was well positioned, their ships arranged in overlapping defensive patterns that would allow for mutual support and coordinated fire. It was textbook military strategy, exactly what any competent commander would do when facing a numerically superior force. He pulled up his own fleet composition and began assigning attack vectors. His hands moved quickly across the holographic controls, dividing his forces into wave formations. First wave, second wave, third wave. Each one larger than the last. In the observation gallery, a Vrelian combat instructor leaned forward to study the human attack plan. His computational mind processed the formation and immediately identified the problem. Those first 2 waves will be annihilated, he said aloud. The defensive positions are too strong. The humans will lose 60 to 70% of those ships before they even reach weapons range. Perhaps they do not understand the enemy capabilities, suggested another instructor. Instructor Voth said nothing, but his chromatophores had shifted to a dark purple color that indicated deep unease. Lucas launched the first wave. 300 crude human warships accelerated toward the enemy position, their engines burning at maximum thrust. They made no attempt at evasive maneuvers or tactical formations. They simply charged forward in a relatively straight line. The Kravian and Velthori fleets opened fire with disciplined precision. Energy weapons and missile batteries targeted the approaching vessels with the kind of calculated efficiency that came from centuries of military development. The human ships began dying in flashes of light and debris. 100 ships destroyed. Then 200. Then 250. The remaining vessels from the first wave reached the enemy defensive line and fired their weapons at point-blank range before being obliterated. The damage they inflicted was minimal, but it forced the enemy fleet to adjust their positions slightly to close the gaps in their formation. The second wave was already entering weapons range. They are repeating the same failed approach, the Vrelian instructor said, his voice carrying confusion and something approaching horror. This is not strategy. This is senseless waste. But Commander Zealith was watching Lucas Reed's face on the observation feed. The human cadet showed no distress, no concern about the massive casualties his forces were taking. He was watching his displays with calm focus, occasionally making small adjustments to the attack vectors of subsequent waves. The second wave died just like the first. 400 ships launched, 320 destroyed, the survivors inflicting slightly more damage before being eliminated. The enemy defensive formation adjusted again, closing ranks, redirecting fire. The third wave was the largest yet. 600 ships, and this time the enemy fleet's weapons were not perfectly positioned. Small gaps had appeared in their overlapping fields of fire. Ships that had expended ammunition needed time to reload. Defensive systems that had been firing continuously were beginning to overheat. 340 human ships died in the third wave. But 260 survived long enough to close to effective combat range, and their crude mass drivers and missile racks began tearing into the enemy fleet at distances where their technological inferiority mattered less. The fourth wave arrived before the enemy could recover from the third. In the observation gallery, The Grand Admiral from the Vandorian fleet had pulled up the casualty statistics and made a sound her translator rendered as horrified disbelief. She turned to Commander Zealith with her tentacles writhing in agitation. They have lost over 1,000 ships in this single engagement. The casualty rate is 78%. This is not acceptable by any standard of civilized warfare. Zealith pulled up the production displays from the human facilities. Her mandibles began clicking rapidly, an unconscious stress response. They built 1,200 replacement ships during this battle, she said quietly. They are replacing losses faster than they are taking them. On the tactical display, the Kravian and Velthori fleet was breaking apart. They had won every exchange, destroyed more enemy ships than they had lost, fought with superior technology and tactical precision. But the human ships kept coming in endless waves, and their own ammunition stores were depleting, their defensive systems were failing, and there was no relief force coming because the humans had already surrounded their home territories with blockading fleets. The enemy fleet attempted to retreat. The fifth human wave, fresh and undamaged, pursued and destroyed them systematically. Lucas marked the engagement as complete and immediately began assigning his surviving ships to new objectives. He had started the battle with approximately 2,000 vessels. He had lost 1,400 of them. He now had 800 survivors and 1,500 newly constructed ships waiting in reserve at the production facilities. He had won the engagement with a net gain in combat power. Next target, he said calmly to Ryan Carter. Carter pulled up the strategic map. The galaxy was color-coded to show territorial control. Blue for the human coalition, red for the 4 resistant factions, gray for neutral space. Blue was spreading like a stain across the map. The Torvan system. They have a strong defensive fleet but limited industrial capacity. Same approach. Same approach. They cannot replace their losses. We can. Nina Hayes was handling the diplomatic channels and she was dealing with a flood of incoming messages. The factions that had already joined the human coalition were sending urgent communications, their tone ranging from concern to panicked. One message from the Belkarian leadership was particularly direct. Your casualty rates are unsustainable. You must reconsider your tactical doctrine. Nina composed a brief response. Our production capacity is sustainable. Our strategy is effective. Maintain your assigned positions and await further instructions. She closed the channel before they could respond. There was no time for lengthy diplomatic discussions about military philosophy. Lily Morgan was monitoring morale indicators across the coalition. The simulation tracked population happiness, military confidence, and political stability. These metrics were supposed to decline when casualties were high. Instead, the human coalition's numbers were holding steady or even improving. How are the morale scores not collapsing? She asked Carter. Because we are winning, Carter replied simply. Every faction in our coalition sees that we are advancing, capturing territory, defeating enemies. They are accepting high casualties because they can see those casualties are achieving results. Wars are not won by preserving your forces. They are won by accomplishing objectives. In the observation gallery, cadet teams from other species were abandoning their own preparation work to watch the human simulation. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. The Vrelian team had spent 45 minutes building detailed economic models and force projection calculations. The Vandorian group was on hour 2 of analyzing historical precedents and cultural factors. The Kravian cadets were carefully wargaming different opening scenarios. The humans had been in active combat for 45 minutes of real time, had fought 3 major fleet engagements, occupied 6 star systems, and were currently conducting simultaneous operations across 14 different fronts. Sophie Grant was managing the industrial production, and she had optimized the process to a degree that made galactic economists question their fundamental assumptions. Her factories were running at theoretical maximum capacity, producing ships that barely met minimum functionality standards, using materials that conventional wisdom said were too inefficient to bother with. But efficiency was not the goal. Volume was the goal. Production rate is holding at 47 vessels per hour, she reported. Projected output over next simulation year, 11,000 units. Tyler Brooks pulled up the enemy force estimates. Combined fleet strength of all remaining hostile factions, approximately 6,000 ships. Most of them are better armed and better protected than ours. Then we will build 12,000 ships and accept that half of them will die, Carter said. The question is not how many we lose. The question is whether we can build them faster than the enemy can destroy them. The simulation advanced to year 5. Then year 6. The human coalition continued its relentless expansion. Every battle followed the same pattern. Overwhelming numerical assault, horrific casualties, tactical victory, immediate replacement of losses, advance to next objective. The remaining resistant factions tried everything. They concentrated their forces for decisive battles. The humans surrounded them and attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. They fortified key systems with heavy defenses. The humans threw enough ships at the defenses that sheer numbers overcame technological advantage. They attempted guerrilla tactics and hit-and-run raids. The humans accepted the losses and kept advancing. By simulation year 7, the strategic map showed 71% of the galaxy under human coalition control. The 4 resistant factions had been reduced to isolated pockets, their industrial capacity crippled, their fleets depleted, their options running out. 48 minutes had passed in real time. In the observation gallery, Commander Zelith pulled up the historical database one more time. She scrolled through 800 years of records, looking at the best performances ever achieved in the Korthian scenario. The highest territorial control rating in history was 34%, achieved by a legendary Thandorian command team that had spent 2 months in preparation and used every minute of their allotted scenario time. The humans had more than doubled that record in less than an hour. She looked at the casualty statistics. The human forces had lost over 30,000 ships since the scenario began. In conventional military thinking, such losses would represent a catastrophic defeat that would take years to recover from. The humans currently had more ships in their fleet than they had started with. An instructor standing nearby was reviewing the human tactical doctrine files that Lucas had submitted to the scenario database. The documents were labeled with titles that seemed designed to disturb: acceptable extinction threshold analysis, mass casualty production ratios, economic sustainability of total war. One file was simply titled, "Why winning quickly is cheaper than winning slowly." The instructor opened that file and read the summary. A 10-year war at low casualty rates produces more total deaths than a 1-year war at high casualty rates. Strategic objective should be minimum time to victory, not minimum casualties per engagement. It was a perspective that inverted 8 centuries of galactic military philosophy. The goal was not to preserve your forces. The goal was to end the war as quickly as possible, regardless of the immediate cost. They are not managing a war, the Grand Admiral said quietly. They are solving a problem. And they are willing to pay any price to solve it quickly. On the main display, the human fleet continued its advance. Another wave of ships launched toward enemy positions. Another battle began. More human vessels died in explosions of light and metal. And in the factories around the captured mining stations, new ships rolled off production lines to replace them before the wreckage had even finished scattering. The simulation's adaptive AI was sophisticated, programmed with 8 centuries of military wisdom from hundreds of species. It learned from every engagement, adapted to enemy tactics, and modified its strategies based on observed patterns. It had been designed to challenge even the most brilliant military minds by evolving its approach in real time. Now, facing an enemy that operated from principles it had never encountered, the AI did something unprecedented. It changed the nature of the conflict entirely. Ryan Carter was studying the strategic map when he noticed the shift. The remaining 4 hostile factions, which had been fighting desperate defensive actions across multiple systems, suddenly began withdrawing. Every fleet, every garrison, every military asset started moving toward a single location, the Korthian core system. "Tyler, are you seeing this?" Carter asked. Tyler Brooks pulled up the tactical feed and frowned. All enemy forces converging on one position. They are abandoning everything else. Either this is the worst strategic decision in history or it is a trap, Nina Hayes finished. She was already scanning the communication channels, looking for additional information. The observation gallery had noticed the change as well. Instructors crowded around displays, analyzing the unexpected movement. This was not typical behavior for the scenario's AI. The Korthian scenario was designed to simulate a complex multi-faction conflict with competing interests and divided attention. The AI consolidating everything into a single system was tactically questionable at best. Instructor Voth was the first to understand. His chromatophores flashed bright orange in alarm as he pulled up the civilian population data. "Commander Zelith, look at this." The display showed something that made even the hardened military instructor pause. The AI was not just concentrating military forces in the Korthian core. It was conducting massive evacuations from every contested territory. Civilian populations were being moved on emergency transports to designated neutral zones scattered across 17 different systems. Each neutral zone was surrounded by automated defensive platforms programmed to protect non-combatants. Each one contained millions of simulated civilians who needed food, medical supplies, and infrastructure support to survive. "It is creating a moral dilemma," the Vandorian Grand Admiral said quietly. "The AI cannot defeat the humans militarily, so it is changing the victory conditions. If the humans push for rapid military victory, civilian casualties will be catastrophic. If they slow down to protect civilians, they lose their primary advantage." In the simulation chamber, Carter leaned back in his command couch and started laughing. It was a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from appreciating a clever move even when directed against you. His team looked at him with mixed expressions of confusion and concern. "What is funny about this?" Lucas Reed asked. "The AI thinks it understands human warfare," Carter said, still chuckling. "It looked at our tactics and concluded that we do not care about casualties. It assumed we separate military objectives from civilian concerns. It made a reasonable assumption based on how we have been fighting." "And that assumption is wrong?" Sophie Grant asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Completely wrong. Lily, pull up Earth's military history. Search for the Berlin airlift, the Marshall Plan, and the civil affairs operations in the Pacific Theater." Lily Morgan accessed the historical databases and began reading. Her eyes widened as she understood what Carter was suggesting. Nina Hayes was already smiling, that predatory smile that made alien observers uncomfortable. "You want to feed them." "Every single one of them," Carter confirmed. "The AI evacuated civilians to create a shield. We are going to turn that shield into a demonstration of why you do not want to fight humans in a prolonged conflict." He pulled up the production capacity reports from Sophie's industrial facilities. "Sophie, can we maintain current military production while also manufacturing humanitarian supplies?" Sophie ran calculations, her fingers dancing across holographic displays. "If we convert 15% of production capacity to food synthesis, medical equipment, and infrastructure materials, yes. It will reduce our ship construction rate from 47 to 39 vessels per hour, but we will still outpace enemy attrition. Do it." "Lily, you are now in charge of the largest humanitarian relief operation this scenario has ever seen. I want supply convoys to every single refugee population the AI established. Food, medicine, water purification systems, temporary shelter, everything they need." In the observation gallery, a visiting officer from the Belkarian Defense Force pulled up the resource allocation models and made a choking sound. "They are going to what? This is insane. You cannot run a military campaign and a humanitarian operation simultaneously at this scale." But Instructor Voth was watching the human cadets' faces, and he recognized something in their expressions. This was not improvisation or desperate adaptation. This was something they had been trained for, something fundamental to how their species approached conflict. "On Earth," Voth said slowly, "there is no separation between winning wars and rebuilding afterward. They think of both as parts of the same process." The humans began implementing their plan with the same brutal efficiency they had applied to military operations. Tyler Brooks divided the fleet into two components: blockade forces to contain the enemy military concentration in the Corthian core, and escort forces to protect the humanitarian convoys. The convoys themselves were a sight that made galactic military theorists question their understanding of logistics. Massive cargo vessels, constructed with the same crude efficiency as the warships, carried thousands of tons of supplies. Each convoy was protected by a screen of armed escorts that would have been considered excessive for military operations, but the humans deployed anyway. Lucas Reed managed the convoy schedules with the same calculating approach he used for fleet battles. First convoy departs in 6 simulation hours. Target, Refugee Zone Alpha 7. Population, 3.2 million. Estimated supply needs, 4,000 tons of food, 800 tons of medical supplies, infrastructure support for temporary housing. "What if the enemy attacks the convoys?" Tyler asked. "Then we accept the losses and send more convoys," Lucas replied. "Same doctrine as military operations. Build faster than they can destroy." The first convoy launched, and the observation gallery watched in silent fascination as human cargo ships, escorted by disposable warships, moved toward the nearest refugee zone. The simulation's AI briefly considered intercepting the convoy with military forces from the Corthian core, but the tactical analysis was clear. Any ships sent to attack the convoy would be destroyed by the escort, and the humans would simply send another convoy. The supplies reached Refugee Zone Alpha 7 without incident. Human personnel, simulated by the scenario's population algorithms, began distributing food and setting up medical facilities. The refugee population, consisting of multiple species that had been displaced by the fighting, received aid that exceeded what their own governments had been providing before the war. Lily Morgan was coordinating with Nina Hayes on the communication strategy. Every supply delivery came with a message broadcast to the refugee populations and transmitted to the remaining hostile factions. This is the Human Coalition. We are providing humanitarian assistance to all displaced civilian populations regardless of faction affiliation. Medical care, food, shelter, and security are being delivered to your location. No political conditions. No military requirements. Your safety is our priority. The message was accompanied by detailed information about supply schedules, distribution points, and communication channels for requesting additional aid. In the observation gallery, a Vrelian ethicist who had come to observe the scenario pulled up the civilian welfare metrics. The numbers showed something that should have been impossible during an active military conflict. Refugee populations in human-controlled zones had lower mortality rates and better living conditions than many civilian populations in peacetime. They are winning hearts and minds, the ethicist said, while simultaneously conducting a military campaign of unprecedented aggression. By simulation year 8, the humans were running convoy operations to all 17 refugee zones. The logistics network required thousands of ships, tens of thousands of tons of supplies, and coordination across multiple star systems. Sophie Grant had optimized the production facilities to manufacture both weapons and food with equal efficiency, treating humanitarian aid as just another resource allocation problem. The enemy forces concentrated in the Corthian core found themselves in an impossible situation. They were militarily blockaded, cut off from reinforcement or supply. But they could not claim the humans were endangering civilians, because the humans were actively protecting and feeding those same civilians. They could not use the refugee populations as leverage, because the refugees were receiving better treatment from the humans than they had received from their own governments. The AI tried to spread propaganda that the human aid came with hidden conditions, but the refugees had direct evidence that contradicted those claims. Food arrived on schedule. Medical care was provided without political screening. Children received education materials. Infrastructure was repaired or replaced. Carter monitored the morale indicators across all populations in the scenario. The numbers told a clear story. Civilian populations in human-controlled zones had high satisfaction ratings. Refugees receiving human aid reported feeling safer than before the conflict. Even populations in the still hostile factions were beginning to question why their governments were fighting against an enemy that seemed more interested in feeding people than conquering them. The AI made a critical error, Carter explained to his team. It assumed we separate military objectives from civilian welfare. Every other species does that because they think of war as a separate category of activity from governance or humanitarian concern. Humans learned centuries ago that you cannot win a war if you destroy the civilization you are fighting for. Military victory means nothing if everyone is dead or starving afterward. Tyler Brooks pulled up the tactical situation around the Corthian core. The blockade was complete. No ships entered or left the system. The concentrated enemy fleet outnumbered the human blockade forces in that immediate area, but any attempt to break out would result in a battle that would exhaust their forces while the humans had endless reinforcements waiting. They are trapped, Tyler observed. But we cannot assault directly without massive casualties even by our standards. The defensive positions are too strong. We do not need to assault, Carter replied. We just wait. Their military is cut off from supplies. Their civilian populations are being fed by us. Every day that passes makes their strategic position weaker while ours gets stronger. This is not a military stalemate. This is a siege where we control all the resources and they control nothing except the fortress they are trapped in. Nina Hayes received a communication from one of the hostile faction governments, transmitted through secure channels. She read it and looked up with an expression of satisfaction. The Torvan leadership wants to negotiate, she announced. They are asking about terms for their civilian populations. Tell them their civilians are already receiving aid and will continue to receive aid regardless of political decisions, Carter instructed. Then ask if their military command wants to discuss surrender terms. In the observation gallery, the Grand Admiral turned to Commander Zelith with tentacles writhing in an expression that combined respect and concern. Do you understand what we are watching? She asked quietly. This is not just a new tactical doctrine. This is a completely different philosophy of warfare. They do not separate military victory from civilian welfare. They do not distinguish between defeating enemies and protecting populations. They treat warfare as a temporary problem that needs to be solved quickly and decisively, followed by immediate humanitarian reconstruction. The entire galactic model of prolonged, managed conflict is based on assumptions these humans do not share. Zealith watched the displays showing human supply convoys moving between refugee zones while the blockade forces maintained their positions around the Corthian core. 48 minutes had passed since the simulation began. The humans controlled 71% of the galaxy, were running humanitarian operations across 17 different zones, and had an enemy fleet trapped in a position where surrender was becoming more logical with each passing simulation hour. "We have been teaching cadets how to manage wars," Zealith said slowly. "These humans are teaching us that the goal should be to end them." The alert sounded at simulation year 9.7, 56 minutes and 43 seconds of real time. It was a sound that had never been heard in the Corthian scenario's 800-year operational history, a chime that most instructors had to check their reference manuals to identify. It was the victory notification. Instructor Voth stared at his display in disbelief. The simulation's AI referee had issued a formal message to all parties in the scenario. He read it 3 times before his chromatophores could settle on a color that expressed what he was feeling. Hostile factions propose unconditional surrender. Terms: complete military disarmament, political integration into Victor Alliance, guaranteed civilian population protection and humanitarian support. Accept terms? In the simulation chamber, Ryan Carter read the same message and looked at his team. Nina Hayes was smiling. Tyler Brooks nodded slowly. Sophie Grant, Lucas Reed, and Lily Morgan all showed expressions of tired satisfaction. "Accept," Carter said simply. The simulation froze. Numbers began cascading across displays as the AI referee calculated final statistics. The observation gallery had gone completely silent, hundreds of instructors and cadets watching the data compile with expressions ranging from shock to something approaching existential crisis. Final territorial control, 100%. Total simulation time, 9 years, 8 months, 12 days. Real-time elapsed, 58 minutes, 17 seconds. Military casualties, human coalition, 164% of starting forces. Losses exceeded initial fleet strength, but production had outpaced attrition throughout the entire conflict. Military casualties, hostile factions, 87% of starting forces. Civilian casualties, all factions, 0.3%. Lower than the galactic average for peacetime accidents. The simulation chamber doors opened with a hiss of pressurized air. 6 human cadets emerged, slightly sweaty from the neural interface couches, blinking in the bright lights of the observation gallery. They found themselves facing what looked like the entire Academy command staff, all wearing expressions that suggested they had just witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of military science. Ryan Carter looked at the assembled crowd with growing concern. "Sir," he addressed Commander Zealith, did something go wrong with the simulation?" Zealith's mandibles worked silently for several seconds before she could form words. "Cadet Lieutenant Carter, please explain what you just did." "We completed the Corthian scenario, sir. We achieved Victory Condition Alpha, which requires territorial control of at least 95% of contested systems and acceptance of surrender terms by all hostile factions. In 58 minutes. Yes, sir. The scenario is designed to be unwinnable." Carter glanced at his teammates before responding carefully. "With respect, sir, the scenario is designed to teach cadets how to manage prolonged stalemate. That is not the same as being unwinnable. It just means the victory conditions require an approach that the scenario designers did not anticipate." The Vandorian Grand Admiral pushed through the crowd, her tentacles moving in agitated patterns. She pulled up a datapad showing the human casualty statistics. "Your forces sustained losses of 164% of your starting strength. You lost more ships than you began with. By any conventional military standard, this represents catastrophic defeat, not victory." Nina Hayes stepped forward to answer. "Ma'am, we did not lose more ships than we began with. We lost more ships than we started with in our initial deployment, but we built replacements faster than we took casualties. At no point in the conflict did our total available forces decline. Our ending fleet strength was higher than our beginning fleet strength. But the casualties themselves are irrelevant if they accomplish the objective," Lucas Reed interjected. "Forgive me, ma'am, but you are measuring success by the wrong metric. The question is not how many ships survived. The question is whether we achieved our strategic objective, and whether our economic and industrial base could sustain the approach we used." A Vrelian combat instructor spoke up, his voice carrying confusion. But your tactical doctrine violates every principle of efficient warfare. You accepted casualty rates that would bankrupt most military organizations. You diverted production capacity to humanitarian operations during active combat. You treated military assets as disposable commodities. This should not work. Sophie Grant answered this time. It works because we built our entire strategy around accepting those costs from the beginning. We did not try to minimize casualties per engagement. We tried to minimize total war duration. A 10-year war at low casualties per battle still produces more total deaths than a 1-year war at high casualties per battle. We chose the approach that ends the conflict faster. But the economic cost, another instructor began. Was sustainable, Sophie interrupted. I can show you the production models. We used inefficient materials and crude construction methods specifically because they allowed for higher production volumes. Yes, our ships cost more resources per unit of combat effectiveness than conventionally built vessels. But we could build them so much faster that the total economic cost was lower than prolonged conventional warfare. Tyler Brooks added, and the humanitarian operations were not some added expense on top of military operations. They were part of the military strategy. We learned centuries ago on Earth that you cannot win a war if you destroy the civilization you are supposedly fighting for. Every military campaign has to be planned with reconstruction in mind, or you just create the conditions for the next war. Commander Zealith pulled up the historical database on the main gallery display. 800 years of records appeared, showing the best performances ever recorded in the Corthian scenario. The previous record for territorial control was 34%, she said slowly. Achieved by a Vandorian command team that spent 2 months in preparation and used every day of the scenarios simulated 10 years. You achieved 100% control in less than 1 hour of real time. Yes, sir, Carter acknowledged. You invalidated 8 centuries of military theory. We applied a different framework, sir. Not better or worse, just different. Instructor Voth stepped forward, his chromatophores cycling through thoughtful colors. Cadet Lieutenant, I need you to explain your strategic philosophy. Not your tactics, we observed those. I need to understand the underlying assumptions that made you think this approach would work. Carter considered the question carefully before answering. Sir, I think the fundamental difference is that galactic military doctrine assumes warfare is about efficient resource management to achieve strategic objectives with minimal casualties. That is a reasonable assumption if you evolved in an environment where resources are generally stable and conflict is relatively rare. Humans evolved in an environment where conflict was constant and resources were uncertain. We developed a different approach. Which is? The Grand Admiral pressed. We approach warfare as a problem that needs to be solved decisively and then ended. Not managed, not balanced, not prolonged into an acceptable stalemate. Solved. And we are willing to accept costs that seem irrational by your standards because, from our perspective, the real irrationality is choosing a 10-year war over a 1-year war just because the shorter war is more expensive in the immediate term. Lily Morgan added, and the humanitarian operations are not separate from the military strategy. They are part of the same problem-solving approach. You cannot claim to have won a war if the population is dead or starving. Military victory without civilian stability is just temporary control that will collapse. So we plan for both simultaneously. A young Belcarian cadet who had been watching from the back of the gallery raised a tentative claw. But if every species fought this way, the galaxy would be consumed by total war. The combined casualties would be enormous. Nina Hayes turned to address the cadet directly, her tone respectful but firm. With respect, that is already happening. It is just happening slowly. The Corthian scenario simulates a 10-year war. How many people die in 10 years of warfare, even at low casualty rates? Our approach did not increase the total cost of war. We just paid it all up front instead of spreading it across a decade. And because we ended the conflict quickly, we could begin reconstruction immediately instead of waiting years. The observation gallery remained silent as the implications settled over the assembled military professionals. These were not cadets who had found some clever exploit in the simulation's programming. They had revealed that the simulation itself, and by extension galactic military doctrine, was built on cultural assumptions that seemed universal but were not. Commander Zealith accessed her command interface and began processing the official evaluation. Around her, other instructors were running the scenario again with different cadet teams, trying to replicate the human approach. The results were consistently catastrophic. Teams that tried to copy the human tactics without understanding the underlying philosophy collapsed into resource depletion and strategic chaos. The approach requires a specific mindset, Instructor Voth observed as they watched another team fail. It is not just about building more ships. It is about accepting uncertainty, embracing calculated risk, and treating warfare as a problem with a definite solution rather than an ongoing condition to be managed. One of the failed attempts came from a Kravian team, a species known for their aggressive nature. They had tried to replicate the human mass assault tactics but had failed to implement the humanitarian component. Their simulation ended with military victory but complete civilian collapse, failing the scenario's stability requirements. A Vrelian team attempted to copy the production methods but could not bring themselves to build ships they knew would be destroyed. Their cultural emphasis on efficiency and preservation made the doctrine psychologically difficult to implement. Commander Zelith finally looked up from her evaluation datapad. Her expression was complex, mixing respect with something that might have been fear or might have been awe. With her species, the emotions use similar muscle groups. Cadet Lieutenant Carter and team, she said formally. You have passed the Corthian scenario with the highest marks ever recorded in this institution's history. Your approach has been flagged for study by the Galactic Defense Command. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. You have also proven something that the Academy will need to seriously consider. Deathworld evolution creates tactical doctrines that the rest of the galaxy has not developed because we never faced the environmental pressures that made such thinking necessary. Your species views warfare not as an extension of politics or a test of military efficiency, but as a problem to be solved through overwhelming force applied with calculated precision until the problem no longer exists. The Grand Admiral added quietly, the galaxy will need to decide whether that philosophy makes humans the most dangerous military power we have ever encountered, or the most valuable allies in any actual existential conflict. She paused and added with dark humor, the betting pools among senior staff are currently running 60-40 in favor of both. Carter accepted the data pad with their official evaluation scores. Perfect marks and strategic innovation. Acceptable marks and conventional doctrine, though the note suggested that acceptable meant they understood conventional approaches even if they chose not to use them. And a special notation that their tactical framework had been classified as a new category of military doctrine requiring further study. As the 6 human cadets left the observation gallery, the assembled instructors and cadets remained, staring at the simulation displays that still showed the final statistics. 58 minutes and 17 seconds. 100% territorial control. 0.3% civilian casualties. Somewhere in the Academy's massive databases, automated systems were already updating training materials, adding new sections on Deathworld tactical doctrine, and flagging the Corthian scenario for review. The test that had been designed to be unwinnable had been solved, and in solving it, 6 human cadets had issued a warning the galaxy was not entirely ready to hear. On Earth, humans had learned through thousands of years of constant warfare that conflicts needed to be won decisively and ended quickly, because the alternative was perpetual suffering. They had learned that military victory without humanitarian concern was hollow, because you could not build peace on corpses and ashes. They had learned that the shortest path between war and peace was through overwhelming force combined with overwhelming compassion. The galaxy had never needed to learn those lessons because the galaxy had never faced the kind of environment that made such brutal efficiency necessary for survival. Now they knew that somewhere among the stars, there was a species that approached warfare not as a chess game or a resource management exercise, but as a problem to be solved with the same determination they brought to any other challenge. With math, with production, with logistics, and with the absolute conviction that the fastest way to peace was through decisive victory followed by immediate reconstruction. And the galaxy would have to decide what that meant for the future.